Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is David Gregory. I'm a business advisor for the Advanced Manufacturing and Transport sector for CBBC. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to what is the third webinar in a series of 5, focusing on the key themes of COP26, which will be held at the beginning of November in Glasgow. Today's webinar concerns itself with the issue of clean transportation, and in particular on how China and UK can work together on the transition to electric vehicles. This series of webinars is in fact just a small part of CBBC's activities planned around COP26, a key part of which is a report exploring the role of UK and China businesses on the road to net zero emissions under the key themes of adaptation and resilience, energy transition, clean transport, which we will be discussing this morning, green finance, and nature. This report is being compiled in partnership with KPMG and other sponsors, including BP, who are sponsoring the Clean Transportation chapter. Each chapter will feature an opening insight piece and will be accompanied by a number of case studies from companies from both the UK and China who are active in that particular field. We will be officially releasing the report at several launch events, the first of which will be held in Guangzhou on October the 28th, Beijing on November the 4th, and Glasgow on November the 9th. Details of these events will become available in due course. So, to today's webinar. Transportation is a huge contributor to global carbon emissions. Estimates are in the 20 to 25% range, with the majority of those emissions being made up by road transport. Electric vehicles have long been identified as a way to achieve a cleaner form of transport, particularly for passenger vehicles, and the pressure is now on to come up with vehicles that are practical and fully supported by the necessary infrastructure. Today's webinar intends to explore some of the issues that need to be tackled in order to get us to the point where the whole EV environment functions. Later in this morning's session, we'll be joined by Frank Thorpe, Managing Director of BYD UK, and Maxine Katjelli of GXS Partners, who, along with our opening speaker, will be forming our panel session. That session will include Q&As, so please feel free to type questions in the box on your screen. But to begin, it's my pleasure to introduce Edward Atai, who is the head of KPMG's Future Mobility Team, Mobility 2030. Edward deals with clients from a number of sectors, including, amongst others, automotive and energy, and supports them in identifying and exploiting opportunities within this ecosystem, as well as providing commercial due diligence support. This morning, Edward is going to lead us off with a presentation covering how KPMG views some of the challenges that have to be overcome in order for us to disengage ourselves from the internal combustion engine. So Ed, over to you if you'd like to share your presentation with us, and go ahead.
Thank you, David. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here today as part of this really interesting and important panel. As Dave said, I'm just going to share some slides on the screen, so please let me know if you can see those okay. Hopefully you can see those. David,
yeah.
Can you confirm? Yeah, thank you. Brilliant. So as noted earlier by David, I lead KPMG's Future Mobility Group. So as David noted, we work with a wide range of players across the mobility ecosystem really, but particularly OEMs and energy players. I've been asked today to provide an overview of some of the future mobility trends that we're seeing, and then just to really set some context around partnering opportunities between UK and China, and then obviously going to bring in Frank and Maxime to provide their expert views too. So starting with the slide I have in front of me, we see a few really dominant trends that are fundamentally disrupting the mobility ecosystem. These are electric vehicles and alternative powertrains. That means battery electric vehicles, it means PHEVs, it means hydrogen, it means other alternative fuels as well, like biofuels. We see also the rise of connected and autonomous vehicles, and finally the rise of mobility services, by which we mean a move away from ownership of vehicles to usership of vehicles and usership of transport generally. And these trends are really being enabled by the sheer speed of technological change, firstly, and digitization alongside that, as well as changing consumer demand. And we're seeing now consumers who really value different things. And what they want is flexibility, which might mean more subscriptions or other flexible vehicle usage models. They want smartphone-enabled services. They want personalization and customization. And actually, we're seeing consumers who are more interested in the environmental impact of their choices than ever before. And that opens up a range of really interesting opportunities. For instance, bundled energy services, amongst other things, which I'm going to come on and talk a bit more about later. And actually, today I'm going to focus really around that kind of energy piece, where I think that there are significant collaboration opportunities. So firstly, I guess to step back and look at EV uptake, because EV is the first trend that's already here and hitting. And it's very clear that both China and the UK are global leaders in terms of EV uptake. In the UK, we have our very ambitious proposed EV ban in 2030, and government has already put in place a broad range of incentives to support the rollout of EVs. I think it's fair to say there's still work to do. I think many in the industry feel there's also the need for a clearer and maybe more transparent roadmap to get to 2030 and beyond, but we're certainly at a good starting point. And then within China, the EV ramp up, as you'll see on this slide, is maybe a little bit less dramatic than in the UK, albeit in absolute terms, it's by far the largest EV market globally, with around 6 million electric vehicles on the road already, and that makes up more than 40% of the global fleet already. And I would also say that these are just the current projections. I think it's very possible that these ambitions could be accelerated faster still, particularly towards the end of the decade. I think that's what we've seen continuously over the last 5 years or so, all of our projections coming further and further to the left. So in summary, I guess on this, two countries right at the forefront of the market, just as it's reaching its tipping point. So in terms of where these opportunities will fall, I think what we're seeing is the shift to electrification is driving some real convergence, particularly between the automotive and energy elements of the value chain. We're moving away from what historically we've seen around linear automotive and energy value chains to actually new value chains which are really converging around the customer. And at the same time, we've got new elements in that value chain as well. Take the battery, for instance, the electric vehicle battery, typically makes up around 40% of the cost of the vehicle, so it's really significant. China's already the world leader in the battery segment, and the UK also has many strengths in that area, like R&D, like some other areas of the value chain as well. And with localization really high on the agenda for the UK at the moment, I think there's some clear opportunities to explore in that field. I think then we have energy services, which I've laid out here and I alluded to earlier. I think this is where it starts to get really interesting, and we're starting to see a lot of new propositions and help some of our clients to architect new propositions in the market. To delve into that in a bit more detail, let me just flick to the next slide. So what we're starting to see is there are a number of archetypes of bundle that are starting to emerge around customer needs. So it's not enough now to provide just a vehicle. So an example of this would be the B2C bundle that we see. So that's focusing on the private consumer. As well as providing the vehicle, you need to provide the public charging access, the home charging, potentially a green retail tariff, of course enabled by time of use tariffs, and then also the software that kind of provides that link to controlling your charger as well. The next step from that, and we're starting to see the kind of initial pilots around it at the moment, are the kind of micro generation bundles. That's where you start to add in things like home solar, the battery storage, and you link it all together with the really important home energy management system, excuse me, which integrates all of the elements together. And so the user can match basically its consumer consumption pattern, sorry, with its energy availability in a seamless way. Then you get on the fleet side, the fleet charging bundle, and that serves the needs of fleets, but it provides also access to public charging, the private infrastructure, the operation and maintenance. It might be a mixture of depot, home and workplace, as well as fleet management and expense software solution support. So again, the software is the bit that's kind of holding the whole thing together. And then finally, we see a kind of energy flexibility bundle, which is an add-on to some of the bundles I've talked about before. And that's where you can start to see actually the ability to generate financial returns through responding to market signals. And examples of things like V2G, where already we're seeing pilots in several markets, including the UK. Of course, those solutions are going to look very different in the UK and China. And that's driven by the regulatory environments, but also demographics. In urban China, for instance, there's a far greater proportion of people living in apartments. And in that context, B2C solutions will be much more centered around the car, and it might include flexible usage options. It might include bundling of broader services like insurance and maintenance. I think another really important takeaway here across all these bundles, as I've kind of alluded to, is that technology layer is really vital, and it's really important as a strategic control point on which to be able to sell on other services. So it's a really important thing to think about when we come to talk about partnering later. So let's then kind of move on to the kind of competitive context, because I think that's also quite interesting. There's a significant number of players who are converging around the customer. I think the key question from our perspective is who becomes what we call the front door for accessing e-mobility services, whether that be the provision of the home charger or access to public charging or other services. At the moment, it's very fragmented. For example, a customer could drive an EV through an agreement with its leasing company, could have a home energy tariff from a utility, and it could be a loyalty customer from one of the oil majors. Each of those players would love to help the customer with getting a home charger, with providing access to the public charging, and ultimately be that trusted energy services provider. And each has a good claim on playing that role. If you look from an OEM perspective, that's an opportunity to extend its current brand relationship, to offer a branded charger and a connected application. It provides that new ongoing relationship with the customer after the sale of the vehicle. It's the approach that's already been pioneered by the likes of Tesla and NIO. I think there's an expectation going forward, as I mentioned earlier, that the OEM has to do more than provide just a great vehicle. It needs to help the customer to be able to change its behaviors and mindset, and that's through delivering these ancillary services. If you then look at the energy players, and here we're talking about traditional utilities, I think they would very much view this as their domain, as it's also, it's still about the sale of electricity, but now it's electricity that powers vehicles rather than the home. And utilities are well placed in some ways as well. They have some capabilities that will be very helpful, like the customer service and billing, but traditionally they don't have the same brand loyalty when you compare it to the OEMs. I think people love their cars, their energy providers not so much, and they don't necessarily always have the digital capabilities that they need to deliver that smooth and seamless customer experience as well. From a leasing perspective, as the charging is often aggregated into monthly bills based on tariffs, a leasing provider can provide that as part of a full service leasing offering, which would include the charging, for instance. And then you have, of course, the oil majors as well. Clearly, there's a risk of reduced footfall, as many drivers will start to charge at home or at work rather than in a refueling station. And they already have that strong brand presence. They know refueling, and they have strong loyalty schemes as well to entice their customers. So they clearly have a strong position here. And then finally have the new entrants as well. And there's a wide range of new entrants. And what we're talking about here are players who are looking to disrupt these traditional relationships through providing a range of services in a kind of technology-led and customer-centric manner. So an example would be Octopus Energy, who's doing this already in the UK. And I think if you look across all of these players, firstly, it's very competitive. But secondly, I think it's also clear that no player has currently got all of the elements it needs. So the key question is, how does each player position itself? And I think partnering will be key. I think it's also important to develop the right kind of relationships with prospective partners, and probably a few things from my perspective, based on the work we've been doing. I think it's important to note that some partnerships will be transitional. They'll be to fill gaps whilst they're being built out. Others might be more enduring. I think in some areas there are a very limited number of available and attractive partners. So sometimes partnerships need to be agreed very quickly. And I think also that there's some really important questions around the role each player takes. And this goes back to the point I made earlier around the real need to maintain strategic control points, which provides you access to the consumer and the ability to sell on further services in the future. So let me just kind of pause and reflect on the kind of key takeaways from my end. So I think the first is, if the future mobility transformation is well underway. In particular, the EV transition is underway in both markets, and really China and the UK are leading the way on a global basis. I think the second point is the evolution is driving opportunities across the ecosystem. New value chain segments are being created, and it's really important to develop the right propositions to address those. The third point is, as I mentioned, although the trends are similar, actually consumer demands will differ in China and the UK. And I think the offerings in each market will need to be cognizant of that. And then finally, I think partnering is, as I mentioned, absolutely key to successful propositions, particularly when entering new markets. And I think we're going to hear a bit more about that in practice shortly. So with that, I'm going to hand back to David. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much indeed, Ed, for that very concise and comprehensive view of the situation. I think my takeaways from it, I think on an encouraging point of view, it's very pleasing to see that China and the UK are both at the forefront of this transition to EVs. I think you've shown very clearly that it is quite a complex picture with, shall we say, players from very many different industries all involved, and it really is not just about the vehicle. The vehicle is really a small part of the whole picture. So thank you for that. We now move into our panel session, in which we're joined by Frank Thorpe of BYD UK and Maxime Katjelli of GXS Partners. There will be an opportunity to put questions and get answers, but before we get into that phase, I'd just like to ask each of you in turn to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your company and activities within the UK-China EV area. So Frank, if I can ask you first to lead off with a little bit about yourself and BYD.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. And it's really good to be here this morning, and interesting to listen to Ed's presentation, really thought-provoking. And what always strikes me about these things is that what's really important here is that we are at a point in time where, you know, real action is required, isn't it? Just talking about change is not adequate given the pressure that the planet is under. I always say to people that the economic world should be a subsidiary of the natural world, not the other way around. You know, we are here to ensure that the planet is protected for future generations. And I think, you know, most importantly, what that requires now is what we've come to realize is real action. And that real action is not just coming along and replacing what already exists with something slightly better. So there's no point approaching this from the point of view of saying, you know, everybody should just replace their diesel car with something potentially better. We've got to be much more radical than that. And what's fascinating for me is representing an organisation like BYD, which was only formed in 1995. So, you know, a fairly new business in historical terms. But what's fascinating about it is that its technological reach and its approach to transitioning everything we do from transportation to personal mobility, energy storage, energy generation is really radical. So BYD's approach to things is to say, look, we don't just want to do it the way it's been done for the last 100 years or replace what is already there. And the evidence of that is that if you look at BYD's technological reach across a number of sectors, from passenger cars right through to rail systems and large energy storage systems, it has an ability to deliver solutions which are both are advanced and innovative, and perhaps people hadn't thought about before, but equally are really beneficial to the local communities in which they're deployed. BYD operates in over 50 countries and has deployed products in markets and sectors that lots of people wouldn't have even heard about. So, you know, it's a really diverse organization, but it's one that approaches the problem from the point of view that BYD alone can't solve this. It's a global issue which needs partnership and collaboration. So really good to be here today, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you, David.
Thanks very much, Frank, for that intro. And I think I think maybe a lot of people didn't really realize the reach and scope of BYD, and that was very interesting to hear. You know, just the number of companies that you're active in alone. So thank you for that. Maxine, over to you, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's quite impressive to see everything that's happening globally, both in UK, China, and in all other parts of the world around going to net zero and seeing how to transform mobility, as Ed said. From what I've seen, I think there are a couple of things that are quite important to understand everything else that we're going to do. There are ambitious plans everywhere. I mean, when you see how much we want to transform an industry that has been traditionally pretty conservative in lots of different ways, and consumers are also pretty conservative. The car really has a status symbol, is a status symbol in lots of parts of the world, including China, including UK, and this will change somewhat in lots of different ways. So we're at a plan of lots of disruptions coming on with lots of ambitious plans. I really like the fact in both Frank's and Ed's note that there are similarities between UK and China, and there are also very important differences. And that's probably what we can discuss here about the different approaches on the other side. The other thing that I've seen is there is a blurring of the lines right now on lots of things happening in EV. You have new entrants who make cars not how they've been made before because they don't know how to. Tesla and NIO especially have really been on a steep learning curve, and they have different approaches that I think that companies who want to contribute to the building of the ecosystem have to understand. And balancing the strength of the experience and the freshness of people who don't know that they can't do the way they want to do it is quite interesting, and I think that lots of companies and lots of clients can benefit from that. So that's what we are doing at GXS Partners. We are based in Hong Kong, and a lot of what we are doing is supporting clients in the world, and a lot of them in UK, growing and developing their business for China. We think that because of where we are and our agility, we can cater to lots of different needs. And as we said, there's lots of similarities in these approaches and also lots of differences between who you talk to and what you're doing. And I personally joined GXS last year after more than 20 years with ExxonMobil, and probably one of the things that is my last 10 years of career with ExxonMobil was about developing the elastomers business. 60% of the elastomers go one way or the other in automotive, in cars. So between tires and car interiors and lots of different elements for weather seals that are going in cars, and EV is also a great opportunity for all these sorts of advanced material that you can find a brilliant ecosystem about in UK. So we are right at the heart of this, and lots of the things that both Frank and Edward mentioned I've seen happening with the customers and the value chains around all this time. This blurring, as Edward put on his slide, you know, there's a confusion now between who provides the energy, who provides the electricity, who charges the car, and who builds the car. And so there are lots of opportunities, but clearly I think that that people who want to embrace this market, especially in China, need a good compacts or people who've been there before and probably have done some of the mistakes.
Thank you very much, Maxime. And I like that term, blurring. It is quite a blurred picture when you look at who's involved at what point of this whole picture. So thank you very much for that. So we're now moving into the part of the session where you, the audience, have an opportunity to put questions to Edward, Maxime, and Frank. I don't see that we've got any questions coming in yet, so please do post your questions, type your questions in if you have any. And in the meantime, we have a few questions to kick off with. And I think, Ed, I'm going to put the first question, or open the first question with yourself. And referring back to your presentation, you highlighted on the first slide what you call disruptive forces, one of which you described as mobility as a service, which is, I guess, usership, ownership models. I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit more on that, of you know, the direction you see this going in.
Yeah, absolutely. Excuse me. So there's a couple of flavors to mobility as a service. You know, the first is more around kind of flexible access to a vehicle. So that might be things like subscriptions and maybe even you know, an opportunity to change vehicle more frequently. I think the second flavor is then more around an as a service model. So actually providing transport as a service, so not actually owning a vehicle, and it might be multimodal. So we have certain players who are already providing multimodal solutions through a single app. Others might be as simple as ride hailing, like an Uber type journey. I think, you know, the interesting thing about multimodal MaaS is it represents a great opportunity at the moment for governments across the world to try and stimulate public transport as well. So we're seeing a lot of activity and thinking around that. And what we see from that mobility as a service is you have to have modularized and scalable platforms. You need to have the really seamless customer journey integration. So it needs to work across modes, you know, on a single ticket, on a single app. It needs to be real time and demand responsive as well, as, you know, obviously pioneered by the likes of Uber. And it needs to be affordable and convenient as well. So we're seeing that there is some real kind of appetite for mobility as a service. We see there may be a potential role for it in a business context, so replacing company cars in the future. I think that will be heavily dependent on the cost element, and particularly thinking around tax treatment of mobility as a service options, but we see subscriptions as a potential alternative in the future. We also see autonomous vehicles in the future driving a huge uptake of mobility as a service as well, in the sense that once you take down the cost of ride hailing and kind of robo taxis, then that will significantly accelerate uptake as well. So it's something where we're seeing a lot of activity at the moment, but I think, you know, huge potential in the future. And once AV comes, I think it will really, you know, be a step change, and I think that will really have a significant impact on vehicle ownership at that point.
Maxime, thanks, Ed. Maxime, Frank, anything else to add to that particular question and response?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Ed. He makes some key points. I mean, what we really need to see is a transition in people's behaviour. And, you know, you made the point in your presentation, Ed, that unfortunately at the moment the personal car is still a status symbol, a reflection of status, wealth, comfort, whatever. It's also, you know, almost a leisure item in some applications. We need to turn public transport into a viable alternative. That means that whole car usage thing gets marginalized more and more. So if the public transport solution is, you know, clean, reliable, affordable, the coverage is what it needs to be, as an alternative to a really expensive form of personal mobility, the car. And at the moment, you know, the car isn't expensive enough from a personal usage point of view. If we can get to that point, I think we will see a modal shift. But at the moment, we're a long way from that. And I think there's a lot of work to be done to get us to a point where we all personally, genuinely make a decision to not have a car sat on our driveways or available for us to use. I think we're a long way off that, but you know, the work's there to be done and the framework's there to achieve it. We just need to get on with it.
Thanks, Frank. I'm just chipping in myself, I guess, before I bring Maxime in. I guess one element of that, of shall we say, using public transport, because it's a good thing to do. It's an efficient way to get around. I guess part of that depends on where you are as well. I mean, if you're in the middle of the city, it tends to be easier. Yeah. I live in a little village in South Yorkshire, not so easy.
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Maxime, anything to add on this one?
Yeah, actually, mobility as a service, it's kind of, I always come from the people who make the cars or try to maintain them, right? More the industrial part of it. And what we've seen is that there is activity in changing the material in the car. If it's your own car and you keep it for 10 years and then you either scrap it or sell it to someone else, or if it's a car that belongs to a fleet which is serviced by someone else, the paradigms and the requirements on material specifications can be slightly different. And there's actually a big appetite for innovation in this space, to which there are brilliant ecosystems in UK of companies who make specialty chemicals that can contribute to that. I'll give you a couple of examples. You know, we talk about public transportations and buses. I think there is quite an interest in refining the raw materials so that the surfaces will not be as dirty by frequent usage as they can be today. We talk about, you know, COVID, antibacterial surfaces, treatments, all of that needs to be thought in the context of this car will be shared. And also what we see generally is that when fleets are being run, the requirements are different. And eventually I remember workshops being held a couple of years ago with OEMs who are trying to think more in terms of, can we actually put these cars apart? You know, you talk about net zero and lowering the emissions. One way to do that is to extend the life of these cars, to make sure that this fleet run as long as possible. If you want to do that, you can actually identify some parts that are pretty sacrificial, that would be easy to dismantle and easy to recycle. And where it's really complicated when we work with our clients and customers is to understand where on the value chain is actually the benefit of that. You know, do we need to talk to the fleet owner? Do we need to talk to the OEM? Does the consumer seeing any good of, if you want to rent a car, you know, there are some of these schemes that exist here where you just have a code and you go and pick up your car wherever it's parked in the street and someone else will have it later. You want the car to be nice and shiny for a long time, in spite of its very intense usage. Raw materials can help you do that. The problem is, like, lots of this material come at a certain cost. They come with benefits too, because if there would be, the car would be probably less expensive to recycle. There are lots of side benefits, societal benefits, as well as environmental benefits associated to that. And I think, you know, finding the right way to show the value in use of any of these tailored materials designed for mobility as a service is something quite interesting and a great opportunity, which is valid in both sides, UK and China. But maybe in a different context, because the fleet management and the OEMs will not interact in the same way with the public.
Thanks, Maxime. Again, plenty to think about there. We've got a question in from Kevin Hudson. I don't know if you can read it on your screen as well. Maxime, this is to you, and it sort of follows on from what you've been talking about. Do you think the use of elastomers will increase as EV demand grows?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. In lots of different ways. When you start elastomers in the car, the first ones, the massive ones, are the tires. And electric cars are typically heavier right now than their IC equivalents because of the battery weight. So therefore, the specifications of the tires are actually being increased as we speak, because people realize that running on a suboptimal pressure in a tire in an IC just means that you're going to go to the gas station a bit more frequently and actually have a more frequent stop on the highway when you're driving an electric car or an electric bus, it might mean a shorter range, and that's a whole different question there. So yeah, there's lots of work and opportunities to basically get to thicker tires that hold pressure for a longer period of time. In the car interior itself, because people don't drive, and it's also related to the other parts of the mutations and transformations that Edward talked about. Because you don't drive the car that much, because you are using Uber or you are using a self-driving car, you are much more sensible. The noise in the car is much more important to you. It's much more part of the comfort of the ride. So it would mean more elastomers in the seals and in the soundproofing in the cars, for instance. And lastly, all around the engine itself, temperature range today in the ICE cars is more north of 150 degrees, which is not so good for lots of plastics and rubber. Advanced elastomers that are mostly thermoplastic can withstand only a lower temperature, but that's good news for them because EV cars are running at a lower temperature. So yeah, overall, lots of opportunities, especially for elastomers in the transformation of the car industry into this CNA, SNE revolution. All of them play a part.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Frank, we've got another question here addressed specifically to yourself from ET. Do you see EVs coexisting or competing with hydrogen, especially for industrial or heavy-duty vehicles? Do we see battery technology growing in capability to address the energy density challenge versus H2?
Yeah, I mean, I represent BYD, who, you know, are invested in the battery technology development and manufacture industry. So I would say that, you know, I see the battery electric solution as a very efficient one. Having said that, hydrogen, you know, is developing significantly and potentially has a role to play in certain applications. The point I would make is that what we are obligated to do is make the best use of every kilowatt of power generated. And the issue I have with hydrogen is that it is a very actual inefficient use of generated kilowatt energy. You know, hydrogen has to be created. It doesn't exist. It has to be created. It's very inefficient in terms of how you create it. It needs lots of energy to do it. It doesn't have an infrastructure network, so we'd have to create one, which would take a lot of energy and effort. And then there are certain significant losses when it's applied in a vehicle. So from kilowatt generated to energy deployed, the losses and the inefficiency of hydrogen currently I have an issue with, because my absolute commitment and belief is that what we need to achieve is absolutely eking out the most of every renewable kilowatt we generate. And, you know, battery electric vehicles are very efficient, although, you know, Maxime makes the point, they do by definition carry a lot of weight around. In terms of losses, they are very efficient. Electric motors and batteries are very efficient. Second part of the question for battery development, I think once the full R&D intent of OEM manufacturers is pointed at electric vehicles, including the battery, I think we'll see significant developments in terms of what they can achieve, and who knows what that is. But certainly what I see from within BYD, you know, I'm amazed at how it progresses so quickly in terms of the new innovations and developments that come out on a sort of almost monthly basis. So I think once the full intent of the OEM sector is focused on it, we'll see significant developments.
Thanks, Frank. I recall as well in your opening comments, you were talking about one of the areas that BYD is very innovative within is energy storage, and related to, you say, eking out every ounce of kilowatt that we can. I think in your case study as well, that will appear in the report, As you say, it's not just about the electric vehicle itself. You're talking about then, shall we say, the whole structure around how the vehicles are charged and even returning energy back to the grid at certain points, if I'm correct.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we currently have the largest commercial scale vehicle to grid project running, which will be at COP26, information about that. And that's a significant partnership with British organisations, SSE and Go Ahead Transport Group. And it's those sort of things that you make the absolute point, David. Who knows what we're able to get out of our new energy ecosystem. And what it isn't is a direct replacement of what we've already got. So I'm really fascinated to see how that vehicle to grid project develops. And the next phase of it, once we're over that technical milestone of it working, the next phase of it is what can we actually do with it?
Thanks, Frank. It keeps coming back to the fact that, this is not just about adapting things, it's about creating new models for all sorts of dimensions of electric vehicles. It does lead on to, you mentioned partnerships several times, I think, and perhaps this is a good opportunity to ask you perhaps about the role of local partnerships that BYD has in the UK and why it's important to the BYD business.
Yeah, absolutely, David. And what's interesting for me, the title of the webinar about, how do we develop partnerships between the UK and China to help this transition? As far as I'm concerned, those partnerships are already up and running and well established. Examples of that is our collaboration in the public transport sector in the UK with a very historic and well-established build partner in the UK called ADL, began in 2016, and as of today, we've deployed over 700 fully electric buses through that partnership. Now, that's equivalent to over 35 million miles of public service provision, over 60,000 tons of CO2. And that was only possible through that collaboration and partnership. And that collaboration and partnership, contrary to the cliches about, suspicion and covert working, has been absolutely open, collaborative, and positive. And where that partnership is today is that people perceive BYD ADL in the UK almost as one entity. So I think that, that's a fantastic demonstration of how the East and the West, China and the UK, genuinely, when there's intent and a problem to solve, work together really well. Other examples of that, as I alluded to, the V2G project with SSE and the Go Ahead Group, again, the open sharing of ideas and technical know-how has been hugely encouraging from my point of view. So I believe the template for partnership and collaboration between China and the UK already exists and will only get better and stronger.
Okay, very good to hear, Frank. Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that? Edward, perhaps? The importance of partnerships?
Yeah, I think as I covered in my presentation earlier, I think there are some real opportunities, and I think that there are some real strengths on both sides for China and UK to bring together. Battery was one example I gave earlier, where clearly China is kind of leading the way globally, but actually the UK is looking to build capability, and I think looking to localize, and I think there's some real opportunities there to link up. I think in terms of bringing some really new and innovative models from one country to the other, I think there's some really great opportunities as well, particularly along the lines I mentioned earlier. So I think that we're at a really interesting point in the mobility transition. I think both countries are doing very well in terms of EV uptake. I think we're going to reach a tipping point in the next kind of 18 months or so where acceleration becomes faster and faster. I think actually bringing together best in class from both countries provides a great platform on which to then expand out further, so into Europe and other parts of Asia. So I think it's a great opportunity at the moment.
Thanks, Ed. Let's change tack a little bit. Let's put another question to you. Maybe I'll start with Maxime for you with this one. Can you give an example or just share your thoughts around what the differences are in the consumer demands in the UK and China? Because they tend to be quite different.
So consumer demands can be different. And I will probably more focus on ecosystems demands. And back to the question a little bit on partnership. I think that some of the way things are working in China, you can't assume that they work just exactly the same. In lots of different ways, when you have a material which is innovative and you want to go and try to make it, making progress in automotive because it brings benefit overall on the overall value chain. Understanding precisely who this is benefiting to along the way is very important and would be very different between China and UK. The structure of tier ones, the structure of OEMs, and the way the markets are structured in who is building cars, who is selling cars, and who is managing fleets are very, very different. So to give you an example, there is very often lots of pretty direct integration between some tier ones and some OEMs that will work really very closely one with another in China. You have local ecosystems that are created by the local governments where pretty much that if you want to sell to SAIC, you need to talk to this particular OEM. If you want to go and penetrate BYD, you know that BYD buys 90% of their stuff for certain parts in the cars or the buses from one tier one. It's pretty different from what we are used to in Europe in general, where you have international companies all competing pretty openly on this market. So I think at a B2B level, for when it is to sell the materials, that's a pretty important difference. And then you need to basically get good guides who can show you who are these links and who can analyze the local market to tell you who you should talk to, because selling something, putting something in the car would mean that you need to convince lots of people on the way, tier twos, tier ones, and car and OEMs.
Yeah, thanks, Maxime. And on that last point about convincing people, you and I have spoken about this before, is the traditional automotive supply chain tends to be quite conservative.
It is.
Yeah.
I always talk about the management of no change. There are 15,000 parts in an average car. An average IC has 15,000 parts, and for each of the parts there will be someone somewhere in an OEM who actually signs down on the specification to convince these people that he has a genuine interest to accept to take a risk. Even if you give him all the risk mitigation methods that you can think about, and you go through, weathering tests and running tests and prototyping and lots of different things, or show that it's actually been used by others, the reluctance to change is pretty high. I think one of the differences that you and I talked about before, David, when we were preparing this, is in general in China, the hurdles are lower than they are in the West. So you can probably have a better chance to go and try things out on small series. And the second thing is that typically new entrants and EV players are also more after change and opportunities, and they are much more in the trial and error methods. Working with Tesla is very different from working with GM. Conservatism is very different. The appetite for change and appetite for differentiation is very different. And they want to sell this difference to their consumers. We're talking about consumer difference. They want to make sure that they cater to the needs of the consumers, and they are more open to do it in very different ways, where I see more conservatism and alignment basically into the traditional OEM spec.
Yep, thanks for that, Maxime. Edward, let me just put the same question back to you, but if we can just talk specifically or think specifically about what the consumer is looking for in the UK and China. And I'm thinking in very broad brush terms here, but the Chinese consumer seems much more, shall we say, in tune and adapted to accepting new technology, just the way that they use screen technology, etc. I mean, is there a marked difference between the consumer in China and the UK on that front, for example?
I think so. I think in China, consumers have certainly digitized more quickly, and then were more comfortable living their life from a smartphone before the UK. I think the UK is now starting to catch up in that regard, and I think that is definitely the way that the market is going in both markets. I think, as I mentioned earlier, some of the demographic changes will mean actually some of the consumer propositions need to be a little bit different, and so in the UK we're thinking very much around building propositions around a home energy management system or building energy management system. Whereas I think in China, it's slightly different. I think we're thinking about building propositions more around the vehicle or around the service. And so we're bundling slightly different things and packaging things in a slightly different way.
Okay, understood. Right, okay, that's interesting. We've got another question coming in here from my colleague, in fact, James. This one is for you, Ed, but we can open it out as well. Is COP26 itself helping to accelerate the mobility transition? That's a thorny question for you, Ed.
So I think in the short term, perhaps there are a few announcements that are coming early because people want to have something interesting to say at COP26. I think if we kind of step back, actually, I think, if you look at UK and China, they're really committed to very ambitious targets around transitioning and accelerating. So I think actually longer term, it's not going to have a significant impact. I think in the short term, there are perhaps some announcements that have come a bit earlier, and I think it is quite helpful to have that kind of milestone. Certainly a lot of the clients we're working with are working around big announcements to launch at COP26 itself. Some of those may have come a bit later if it weren't for COP26, but I think actually the general direction of travel is clear, and there is a clear kind of commitment from both China and the UK around all of these types of things.
Thanks, Ed. Frank, have you got anything to add on that? Do you think COP26 is helping accelerate things?
Listen, I don't think it's not a good thing to have these global forums, but only if they lead to direct action. So, the output from COP26 needs to result in direct action, not a lot of discussion and then scheduling the next conference. It doesn't really serve any purpose for me. But having said that, I do feel a lot of positivity and a lot of, intent around everything that's associated with it. Let's hope it can focus people and lead to some announcements, some key decisions. As Ed says, I think, in the UK, we're being very ambitious, and we're seeing that on the ground. We are making those inroads and changes, which is encouraging. But I think as a global challenge, it's much more difficult, isn't it? Because you have to align so many things. But no, it's good to have it in the UK. It's good that it's in Glasgow. We will have an electric bus fleet servicing it as a conference. So you've got to acknowledge those things. It's progress.
Absolutely. When you say you'd like to see more concrete things, if I'm quoting you correctly, coming out of it, what does that mean? More regulations in the short term on the path to 2030, for example, being imposed?
Absolutely.
More investment?
David. Yeah, we need milestones that people know are coming, because what you can't rely on is people to change their personal behaviour for the good of the planet, because unfortunately, we're all leading our lives, aren't we? So we need to work to milestones. If you look at in the UK, the milestones which have been set, the 2030 one for passenger cars, one that people won't be aware of. For example, in London, the whole red bus fleet, the Transport for London bus fleet, needs to be zero emission by 2037. So there's a milestone, and you know, once you've got that milestone, that starts putting into play the actions required to achieve it. And it seems very straightforward to me that once you've got a goal, you work out how you get there. And I think the problem is that on too much of this stuff, you know, whether it's the politicians or whatever, they're prevaricating on making those decisions. Now in the UK, we've taken some hard decisions. You know, some would say they're not ambitious enough, but that's a discussion point. But at least we have targets that we know by 2030, by 2050, 2037 in London, things are going to change.
I would agree, and you know, you say there could be a lot of commentary on how far along the route we are, but having, shall we say, put those deadlines in place, for certain, if you look back over last few years, things have developed at a very rapid pace compared to almost no movement before that. So yes, something is moving, but is it fast enough is another question, and what else can be done to move it quicker. Maxime, we're approaching the end of the session, but have you got any comments to add on that? Is COP26 helping to accelerate this?
Well, I think you know, generally for all of us living here, it's probably a good idea that anything we can do to accelerate this sorts of transition is happening. What I see is that I really second Frank on the fact that, you know, the more clarity there can be on the West, on aligning the different policies and basically having a big plan will probably help some of the actors actually thinking about what they want to invest on. We talked about hydrogen before, you know. I don't know how much hydrogen infrastructure we want to put in the ground right now, given how much green hydrogen we will eventually have once we are at net zero. I'm a bit concerned to see here in my service station nearby, they've been building a demonstration hydrogen filling station here to demonstrate that it's actually possible to drive on hydrogen. One side of me, the engineer, is very excited. The other side of me, the more citizen, is much more concerned, because they said there's no way that we can do that without actually producing much more CO2 than with an internal combustion engine, and certainly more CO2 than producing electricity to run a bus. So all of these pieces are kind of up in the air, and I think that COP26 are typically events in the West that are good places to go and align on the kind of regulations, specifications, requirements, and basically bring the minds together on bringing a coherent plan. I think on the Chinese side of the equation, it's kind of different. There is a plan. There is an overarching plan. And if there's one thing that we have to recognize, is that the importance of understanding the local regulations in China is very high. And what we see right now is that China is really benefiting from all of this, and basically putting the right energy plan to go to the right convergence in 2030 or 2035 or 2050, depending on which part of the transition you want to see. I think it's clear that the plan is much more organized on this end. We can see that you know, it's a controlled economy in which kind of plants you can build, which kind of refineries you can actually build up, which kind of refineries you are converting, which kind of plastics you are promoting in China or are allowed. I think it's much more coherent on the Chinese side than it is right now on the West side. So if they have one hope, is that COP26 is again another opportunity to come to the point of saying, hey, we want to invest in this, we want to have the right batteries, we want to have the right buses, we want to have the right infrastructures to go and support them. And fortunately, then the industries working in the free market will be able to understand, sniff the air a bit more on understanding where is it that you want to play, so that you are really placing your bets on the things that are most likely to win, because most likely to win means most likely to contribute greatly to net zero emissions by 2050.
Thanks very much, Maxime, for those comments. We could, gentlemen, go on, I think, for quite some time with numerous questions relating to all this, but unfortunately we are coming to the end of our session. So let me start by thanking our speakers and panelists, Ed Attai of KPMG, Frank Thorpe of BYD UK and Maxime Catgelli of GXS Partners for their very insightful contributions and an interesting discussion, I think, this morning. And also, of course, for you, the audience who've taken the time to tune in and join us this morning for what I hope you also thought was an interesting session. So finally, I'd just like to remind you that there are 2 more webinars as part of this program yet to come. On the 30th of September, we will be covering the subject of green finance. And then on the 13th of October, the final webinar will be covering nature. You can sign up and register for these via our website. So it's just for me to say thanks to you all again and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
Many thanks.